All right. Anyways, yeah, so 32.3, a really random section in a kind of a random chapter, but it's going over homeostasis. And think about it. Our environment fluctuates. Our environment is always changing, but we keep the same body temperature, or we want to keep the same pH inside our cells and outside our cells. And so basically, organisms have to always be responding to their environment. If you can't respond to your environment, you're probably not going to survive very long. And there's generally speaking, there's two different ways that animals respond to their environment. And this might be something you probably didn't really learn much about in freshman bio, which is regulating and conforming. So I'm going to cursor over here. Something that is a regulator is an organism that will change their internal conditions to match whatever's going on externally. An example would be like body temperature. Like, we are regulators of our body temperature. No matter the temperature outside, it could be really cold outside, really hot outside, and we will regulate ourselves where we keep a constant body temperature. Now, a conformer is something that is an animal or an organism that will change its internal conditions to match the external environment. So let me show you using the example of body temperature to help understand the difference. So regulator, like a river otter like us, no matter the outside temperature, so notice the x-axis is the outside temperature, it could be getting colder, hotter, but a regulator will keep their internal body temperature more or less constant. Whereas something that is a conformer, they conform to their environment. They will adjust their body temperature to whatever the outside environment is. And it's kind of fascinating, the biology of conformers, because basically they literally have to change essentially all of their cells sometimes in order to respond to that actual temperature. All right, so understand those two basic differences. And within conformers, there might be like some traits that they will be regulators for. For example, solute concentration. So the amount of, remember, solvent is doing the dissolving. So the solvent in living things is water. Solutes are the things that are dissolved in water. So a fish, for example, it can like maybe conform its body temperature to its outside environment, but it will regulate the solute concentration, making sure that fluid around their cells is made up with the same percentage of solutes compared to the solvent, compared to the amount of water. All right, so homeostasis, the basic idea of homeostasis is balance, or maintaining a steady state. I think of home, if you call someplace home, it's a place that you would say is peaceful, you're stable there. So homeostasis, the steady state. And as I said earlier, humans, like body temperature, blood pH, glucose concentration, the amount of sugar we have in our blood that circulates around all of our cells, we want to keep that at constant levels. You don't want it too high or too low. All right, so an example for homeostasis, kind of a mechanical example, would be like how a thermostat works. So if we, let's say we have the room temperature set at 20 degrees Celsius, we would call that the set point, okay? And you then get some sort of stimulus. So you want to know kind of the different parts of regulation, where you have a stimulus, that's something from your outside environment. So this stimulus would be room temperature increases. You will have something that will respond. You have a sensor that will sense that, hey, the room temperature has increased. Then you get a response. And that's kind of your three basic parts. You have a stimulus. You have a sensor that senses that stimulus, that either you got the temperature went too high, or in this case, it went too low, and then you get a response. So here the response is the air conditioner turns on, cooling down the room. It could also be, your response could be the heater turning on if it got too cold. So pretty basic idea, but understanding stimulus, sensor, and response. So for humans, like our set point could be our body temperature, again, our blood pH, things like that. Homeostasis is mainly controlled by, negative feedback. This first bullet point will make a little more sense a little bit later on. I'm going to show you the difference between negative and positive feedback, but just kind of keep that in mind. Homeostasis is mainly controlled by negative feedback mechanisms. Homeostasis will moderate, but not eliminate changes to the internal environment. Meaning, if it gets too cold outside, there's a limit to how much we can moderate our body temperature. You can't perfectly monitor your blood pH or your body temperature, but we can get it pretty close. And then, yeah. So moving on. All right, an example of homeostasis that we're going to focus on is thermoregulation. So thermo, heat, regulation, kind of controlling something. Making sure it doesn't get too far off the normal amount. So looking at how do animals regulate their internal temperature. And there are, broadly speaking, two types of organisms. And I know we talked about this a little bit earlier in the year when we were looking at the mealworms. But you have endothermic organisms and ectothermic organisms. So endo, think internal, endo. They are organisms that generate their heat inside, endo, by metabolism. So that would be by cellular respiration. We talked about how cellular respiration, a lot of that energy is lost as heat. Well, that heat isn't just completely wasted. For endothermic organisms, they will channel the heat from cellular respiration to help keep their body temperature constant. Ectothermic organisms, they don't have the mechanism to generate their heat from cellular respiration. Or another way endothermic organisms get their heat would be muscle contraction. So shivering, if it gets too cold outside, your muscles will move back and forth to create heat to warm yourselves up. Ectothermic organisms, they don't have that ability. Note the general kind of categories of who's endothermic, who's ectothermic. Birds and mammals are typically going to be your endotherms. And then know your invertebrates, fish, amphibians, and some of your non-avian reptiles, they're going to be ectothermic. Okay, meaning they need external heat to get their body temperature. So let me show you. So an example of an ectotherm would be an organism. You have a turtle that will lay on a rock and warm itself up by the sunlight coming and warming itself up. Or maybe an organism that will cool itself down by going in the shade or something. That would be an example of they regulate themselves by not by generating heat from inside or by sweating to cool themselves down, but a lot of times it's behavioral mechanisms to adjust their body temperature. Endotherms, because endotherms have the ability to heat themselves up and cool themselves down, that gives them they can be stable with their temperature in changing environments that can change in their temperature a lot. In other words, ectotherms typically are going to be organisms that are going to thrive in a climate that's a little more constant because they're not as good as being able to change their body temperature to the outside environment. This last bullet point is kind of interesting. Ectotherms, because they don't generate their heat by cellular respiration, they usually need to consume less food. Meaning they more of that, they get more out of their food essentially. They don't wait. I say waste in air quotes because it's not really waste if you're using food to warm your body temperature, but more of their food is just going towards just living and surviving, not towards heat production. All right, so here's two examples, endotherm and ectotherm. So your penguins, these would be endotherms, right? So you're wow, how can they survive in that really cold environment? Well, they can adjust maybe the amount of insulation that they have to keep themselves warm. They could do a little more cellular respiration, where they can just only produce heat from that cellular respiration, not as much ATP to keep themselves warm. Whereas ectotherms, here your turtles, they're oh, I'm feeling cold, they'll climb out on a tree branch and warm themselves up. Now, obviously, if anybody has dogs or cats, you've seen dogs and cats do a similar behavioral thing. That isn't to say like endotherms don't have like behavioral ways to heat themselves up or cool themselves down, but it's just saying that endotherms can survive without just laying in the sun to warm themselves up. Oh yeah, so looking at how we control our body temperature using our circulatory system. So like your body core, that's gonna be like where like the most heat is at in your body, because like it's your internal temperature. So let's say, all right, you are getting too hot. You will do vasodilation, and that will help you get heat loss. Because like if you do vasodilation, superficial, those are blood vessels that are closer to the surface. So you've seen this before, like if you work out a lot or something, like, or you're like running or something, what do you notice about like the veins on your body? They start standing out more. That is vasodilation. Your body is getting too hot, so you're trying to you're dilating, you're widening those blood vessels closer to the surface of your skin so that they can release heat. Now the opposite of that is vasoconstriction. So all right, it's too cold outside, so you don't want to lose as much of that body heat on the surface of your skin, and you would need to maintain that body core temperature, so you'll vasoconstrict so you prevent the heat loss that you got from vasodilation. Okay, so that's the first kind of thermoregulation by the circulatory system. The second one would be something called countercurrent exchange. So this sounds very complicated. Counter, like if you're countering something, you're kind of like in response to something. Current, think of, or something is like counter, like it could be something running that way. Something is countering that, it's running the opposite direction. Currents referring to movement. Exchange, you're moving things back and forth, like you're exchanging money, trading things back and forth. So countercurrent heat exchange is where if you have an artery and a vein, where an artery is taking blood, A for away, arteries take blood away from your heart, veins are away, like going towards the other parts of your body. Veins are returning the blood back to your heart. So as those arteries and veins, let me jump to a picture of it. As the arteries are going away from your body and veins are bringing the blood back towards the core of your body, the arteries, because they're coming right from the heart, they're pumping the blood right from the heart, the blood is the warmest there. The veins, because they're coming from the surface of your body, they're the coldest. So arteries are the hottest. Veins are going to be the coldest. So if we run arteries and veins next to each other, we can pass the heat from that's what they're showing with these arrows here, you can pass the heat from the artery to warm up the blood from the vein. Because think about it, if it's really cold outside, and so you're like, oh, okay, but I gotta get blood to the surface of my skin. Well, the issue is you're then exposing that blood to really cold temperatures. And so the worry is you don't want to pass really cold blood back to your heart. That's not a very good system. So as that blood from your veins is returning back towards the heart, what you can do is, if you're then passing the blood that just came from the heart that's warmer, you can pass some of that heat so the blood from the veins that's going back towards the heart isn't as cold. I don't know if you're picturing that very well, but it makes a lot of sense, right? The basic idea would be like, oh, if somebody's really cold, I'm up here shivering, or if I don't know if you ever somebody's hands are super cold, you could cup your hands over them to warm them up. You're passing the warmth from your hands to their hands. That's basically what's going on. The warmth of the artery is going to the colder blood in the veins. So, anyways, countercurrent heat exchange. Let's see. And I mentioned this earlier. Another way that especially birds and mammals can regulate their temperature is by adjusting the amount of insulation. So like blubber, fat, gets too cold, you can get a little more insulation, a little little more blubber on you to prevent yourself from getting too cold. For ectotherms, a way they can, the fancy word is acclimatization. Think acclimate. You know, I don't know if that's like how often that's used in your everyday life, but if you're like, oh, I'm getting acclimated to this environment, you're getting used to that environment. So ectotherms can acclimate themselves to like really cold temperatures by making, and this is crazy, antifreeze proteins. I don't say proteins. Compounds, usually proteins. Because think about this, if you take a water bottle and you put it in the freezer, what will happen to that water bottle? Or like a can of soda, and if you put it in the freezer to maybe like, oh, you want to cool it down, but you forget about it, what can happen to that can of soda? It expands, it can explode. Water will expand when it freezes. So the issue is if you're an organism, like say you're an ectotherm, like you're a fish living in a really, really cold water, sub-zero water, well, that fish is primarily made of water, as are all organisms, and water expands when it freezes, so that's an issue, right? How are we going to prevent the cells from not just exploding from all the water expanding, from all those ice crystals? Well, if you have antifreeze, you put antifreeze in your car, like helping to like prevent things from freezing. Antifreeze proteins will help prevent ice from forming in their cells. And I just think that's a wild idea that like fish can do that. It's a pretty complicated adjustment at the very cellular level. So the purpose of that example is at the cellular level. Adding fat to an organism, that isn't really at the cellular level. That's going to be at the whole organ level. Okay. So I mentioned the whole thermostat example earlier on. This would be kind of like the human example of like the thermostat. And I mentioned earlier that homeostasis is controlled by negative feedback primarily. So this would be an example of negative feedback. So let's walk through it. You have your set point. So the human body temperature set point is 36 to 38 degrees Celsius, so about like 98 degrees Fahrenheit. If your body temperature gets too hot, right, it's too hot outside, you will have a sensor in your brain, so your hypothalamus, hypo below, thalamus is another part of the brain, so the hypothalamus is just below the thalamus. The hypothalamus would be your sensor. It senses the blood will pass by the neurons in the hypothalamus. They will sense that your body temperature has gotten too hot. So what they'll then do is they will send out nerve impulses that will cause the vasodilation. So vasodilation and sweating so that we can release some of that heat. That would be your response. This would be your response. And this would be your stimulus, like the stimulus being it got too hot outside. So again, stimulus, sensor, response. All right, and then that gets you back to your set point. Then the opposite of that would be you have your stimulus. Temperature got too low, so here is your stimulus. That blue is not very good. So again, in your hypothalamus, it could then recognize, okay, temperature is too low, so now, so again, hypothalamus is your sensor, and so then your response would be your muscles here will then move back and forth. You'll shiver to help warm up your body temperature, and then this is showing vasoconstriction that we talked about earlier. Okay. We call that negative feedback because we will if we get too far off of where we should be, we will respond negatively to shut that thing down to get back to our normal point. In a couple of slides, I'm going to show you positive feedback, and I'll show you them right next to each other. And when you see positive feedback, negative feedback will make a little more sense. But is there any questions on this? All right. This should be saying everything I said here. This last bullet point, fever is a result of a change in the set point. So And we don't really actually completely understand why the body will go into a fever, like why you'll elevate your body temperature when you get sick. But anyways, your body can change its set point is the point of that last bullet point. You're technically not always set at like that 98 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so positive versus negative feedback. So I want you to understand the difference between the two of them. So positive feedback, a classic example would be, and what they're showing here is birth. So positive feedback, if you have some sort of stimulus, so in positive feedback, a stimulus will increase the response. Negative feedback, a stimulus will not increase response, but it'll increase like the set point. Like that isn't even the right way to say it. I don't know how exactly how to put it, but like let me just go over the example. So like in positive feedback, so like the head is gonna push against the cervix. When there's nerves in the cervix, so nerves in cervix that will sense that the baby is pushing, trying to come out. They will then travel to the brain, and in the brain, the pituitary gland will release something called oxytocin. So oxytocin, that will go through the bloodstream, and that will tell the uterus, hey, we're trying to give birth. We should do more uterine contractions. So you will increase the amount of contractions in the uterus. And this is the key thing to recognize. The more uterine contractions, the more the nerves in the cervix are being pressed upon by the baby, which means the more nerve impulses that are going to the pituitary gland, which means you get more oxytocin, which means the uterus contracts more, and it keeps going. It's like a snowball effect. I don't know quite how to say it best with this, but I'll show you another example of positive feedback. But like the more it happens, the faster it happens, like a snowball effect. Whereas negative feedback would be like temperature regulation that we saw earlier. You have your set point, and so if your body, like here's your set point, 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, it got too hot outside, so we're gonna sweat. Or it gets too cold outside. You always want to get back to that set point. Whereas in positive feedback, you don't mind you want to get away from that set point. You want to get away from like your homeostasis. Let me give you one more example of a positive feedback, and that would be blood clotting. So in blood clotting, okay, you get a cut in your blood vessel wall, and positive feedback gets initiated, where platelets will go to the site, and they're going to release chemicals that will attract more platelets. And then those platelets become attracted, and they release more chemicals, which attract more platelets, which release more chemicals, which attract, and you keep doing this until you have healed the cut, and then the signal will stop. Okay, so positive feedback. Think of the snowball effect. Okay. Any questions on that? There should be a review of freshman bio, negative and positive feedback. Okay.